13 at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Brookline. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Today we will be focusing on the 1998 economic forecast with a distinguished panel of experts. The panel of experts will be moderated by Dan Goldy. I can tell you that some people who become president of the City Club mostly fear and are intimidated by the prospect of introducing to club members the governor and the mayor. For me, it was Dan Goldy, and we'll come to that later. A couple of announcements. On January 30th, we'll hope you'll join us for the State of the City address with Mayor Vera Katz. Last week, we began a special membership drive, and we have a task force of 40 members who are in the process of recruiting new members between now and February 28th. People who join during that period of time will not have to pay the usual $25 new member fee. So if you've been thinking of joining the City Club, this is a great time to do it, and we do hope you will do that. Please note in this week's bulletin that volunteers can still join a year-long study of privatization of government services in Oregon. And if you're interested, please complete the form in the bulletin and send it to the club office. Our board host today is Carolyn Bullard, seated at the head table, professor of early childhood education at Lewis and Clark College, member of the Board of Governors, and chair of the research board for the City Club. So if you have ideas, things you think that need to be evaluated by City Club, bring them to Carolyn's attention. She will ask the first question of our panel, and following Carolyn's question, as is our custom, we will open up questions to the panel to members of the City Club who are in the audience. And please line up behind this microphone while Carolyn is still speaking. We will be timing questions at 30 seconds because we do want to ask lots of questions, hopefully not many, if any, statements. Please focus on questions to the members of the panel. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part because of corporate underwriting from Portland General Corporation, Wells Fargo Bank, and Providence Health Systems, and we are indeed grateful for this support. Well, now I need to introduce to you Dan Goldy, who will tell you about the panel members. Dan is presently the secretary of the I'm presently the treasurer. I'm just terrified even speaking about Dan. He's presently the treasurer of the City Club, where I can assure you he serves you all nobly and keeps us all on our toes. He's a delightful person and an extraordinarily knowledgeable and articulate person to have on board, helping to run the City Club, and you'll see today that is hardly his only talent. John Mitchell, the chief economist for U.S. Bank, will forecast the national economy. Paul Warner, Oregon state economist, will forecast the state's economy over the next year. And Loren Wyss, an investment consultant, will forecast the financial markets over the next year. And Dan will be our moderator, and at the present time, I wish to turn the program over to him. Dan Goldy.
That was so nice, Fran. I wish you wouldn't quit. Just keep going. I want to say on the way in, one of the members asked me, we got economic forecast today, what's an economist? And I didn't have my Webster's dictionary with me today, so I had to reach back in my mind, and I came up with an old definition that I remembered, that an economist is a person who is good with figures but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. Now, I hope you'll all agree with me. I hope you'll all agree with me that when we're through here today, that you will see that we do too have the personality to be accountants. The way we're going to proceed is that each speaker will have 7 minutes to present their view, and then we're going to take 10 minutes to ask. The panelists will have an opportunity to ask each other questions, but we've limited it to one question per panelist so that we can get through that and then turn the questioning over to you. And before we begin, I just want to say I cheated. I asked the panelists beforehand to take into account in their forecasts 4 basic questions that overhang the forecast for the economy for 1998. And I want to share with you what those 4 questions were, and even whether or not they allude to those questions directly in their statements. You may, if they don't, but they will have taken them into account. And the 4 questions are these. 1, how severe will the impact on the U.S. economy be of the Asian economic crisis? And will the crisis get a lot worse if the President and Secretary Rubin cannot persuade the Congress to provide the funds, the U.S. contribution to the International Monetary Fund? The second question is, with President Clinton planning to present a balanced budget to the Congress 3 years ahead of schedule, he's doing it in the next fiscal year, and considering the fact that the federal budget does not distinguish, as all state budgets do, and cities and private business budgets, between capital expenditures and operating expenditures, will a balanced budget on top of the anticipated slowdown from the Asian crisis be a sufficient fiscal drag on the U.S. economy as to possibly throw us into a recession? My third question was something that has been bruited about by economists but didn't actually get national publicity until Alan Greenspan gave voice to it in a speech in Chicago before the American Economics Association a couple of weeks ago, and that is the possibility of deflation hitting our economy. Deflation is what's happened to some of the Asian economies where stock prices, bond prices, real estate values have plummeted 3/4 to 80%. Severe drop in asset values. Greenspan mentioned it as a possibility, thought that Fed could counter it if it turned up. I've asked them to take that into account. And finally, my final question was the glitch in the computers over the year 2000 and the billions of dollars that companies will have to spend in order to deal with that double zero that will show up, and not knowing whether it's the year 1900 or the year 2000, and whether or not the billions that the companies will have to spend will so affect their bottom line as to create a depressed market in securities and also adversely affect the economy. Well, those were my questions. You guys dream up some good ones on your own. John Mitchell.
Thanks, Dan. It's very nice to be here. What I try to do, I've got my 7 minutes going here. What I try to do at the start of the year is I put my outlook in a poem, and I'm not going to use the whole one because I'm not going to talk about that. Not going to talk about the state at all. The poem is entitled 1997-98. 91, 92, 93, 94. Then it went on for 3 years more. More growth, less inflation, and jobs for most all. Lurking about were no signs of a fall. Consumers were joyous, their spending quite strong. Higher wages and wealth gains that kept coming along. Capacity was rising at 1% over 4. Equipment was flying virtually out of the door. Inflation was falling as the year passed by, in part because the dollar was oh so high. Big Al was watching, moving once in the spring. To be sure we remembered this was no wild fling. The deficit fell to the area near nil. Only $22 billion out of $1.6 trillion. The result was an orgy of tax cuts and spending to prevent a balance before the century was ending. Euphoria faded as Halloween came, and October lived up to its Dow-wrenching name. Down went the Hang Seng, the one it fell fast. Our upturn was likely to slow but last. There will be some rain on 98's parade. Consumer spending will show some fade. More modest investment and trade that will sag upon the growth rate will act as a drag. Nearer 2 than to 3 will the CPI stay. Our long low inflation will not fray. The rate band of late will shift slightly down as signs of slowing do come around. The states in this corner have been faring quite well, but we must remember things aren't always this swell. The sounds from East Asia in no fast track may over time be for us a setback. Does that deal with the questions, Dan? In the last couple of weeks, I've sort of done more movie going than I normally do, and 2 movies sort of stuck in my mind, and I thought I could relate my remarks to those. The first was It Doesn't Get Any Better, and the other was Titanic. If you look at U.S. macroeconomic performance at the present time, you follow the economy, the numbers are truly astounding. Okay. Since November of 1982, we have had 8 months of recession in the United States. It is the longest period of sustained growth that we have ever had. Inflation is at the point that Dan alluded to, that someone can stand up in front of a group of people and talk about the word deflation and not be carted off or dismissed instantly. That is probably as close now to a working definition of price stability as you can get, when you've got some people talking about deflation, and this morning's Investors Business Daily had a speech by Alan Meltzer warning about inflation. You probably can't do much better than that from a price stability. Consumer confidence rose again in December, is at levels that we've not seen in a quarter of a century. The fraction of the adult population working in the December report was 64.1% across the nation. The problem is finding people. For all practical purposes, the deficit is gone. I don't think the fiscal drag is going to be significant because it is so small relative to an $8 trillion economy. Plus, we have some tax cuts that kicked in the first of the year. We're in the 82nd month of the expansion. That's the Jack Nicholson world. Okay, but you think about the other movie, and you pick up the paper, whether you're talking Oregonian, others. Daily newspapers now have sort of an Asia warning section, where they talk about what's going on. We've seen countries formerly called tigers whose performance, if you like, has been tamed. The implications for the U.S. economy fall in several areas. We will see weaker export growth from the U.S. economy. You don't see it in the trade numbers yet, but export orders, the Purchasing Managers Survey, have dropped to the lowest levels in a couple of years. With the changes in currency values, the declines in wealth, falling standards of living, that's going to make it tough for U.S. exporters. The flip side of that, of course, is that imports will be encouraged in the United States. We're likely to see swings in the trade balance with weakening exports and strengthening imports. That will be a dampener on U.S. performance. On the inflation side, the prospects with the strengthening dollar, the falling prices of those other currencies, the dollar's up about 16% since the middle of last year. That will again play a role in holding down price level pressures in the U.S. with falling import prices. From an interest rate standpoint, we've seen a plunge in interest rates related in part to the events in Asia with the flight to safety bidding up the price and down the yield, leading to, of course, a major refi bonanza and low interest rates that will help support certain kinds of spending, helping to offset some of the effects of the weakening exports. You dump this external event on top of a relatively strong U.S. economy with great performance, and what I think it spells is slower growth, but not a decline. You can play with the numbers and get a hit from Asia in the 0.5% to 1% range in terms of the growth rates. Last year we probably came in the 3.7, 3.8 range. So I can think you can look for performance in 1998 in the mid 2s. From an inflation perspective, again, last year CPI rose 2.3% on an annual average basis. The success on the inflation front, I think, is due over time, of course, to monetary policy, starting with Paul Volcker, Greenspan following through. We've also had some positive supply shocks. The price of crude oil a year ago was about $24 a barrel. Yesterday it was down to a little bit over the $16 a barrel. That's a sort of a positive supply shock from our perspective. Import prices fell 4.9% in the year to December.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. What I suspect we're going to see is a continuation of that low inflation environment. Again, inflation near 2 as we move through 1998. If we look at interest rates, we've seen major declines reflecting the coming together. The Asian crisis, disappearance of the deficit, prospects for continued low inflation, and the Fed on hold. The yield curve is almost flat. The risks, I think, are balanced. I don't think you're going to see major changes in rates over the course of the next year. The risks, where does the Asian thing stop? Fueling protectionist fires, and then the one that's out there is the Y2K problem in terms of will the system work. But it's not 1998, it is beyond. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. John and I had just done this on Friday, met in Redmond and did joint discussion. My job as a forecaster is truly a humbling one. It's one of the few jobs you can get paid for and everybody knows you're wrong. But we try to develop a forecast that we think is a consensus that's reasonable among people that have followed these kinds of things. And we're looking for a forecast that's objective and middle of the road. And I think now is a time where we see a wider range of possibilities in Oregon than we've seen in some time. And frankly, as John described the national scene, you can add about 10% to all of those good things and you come up with Oregon's story. The last 3 years have been truly remarkable in this state. Our job growth has been 4% a year. We've been a top 10 state in terms of job growth, in terms of wage growth per worker, in terms of per capita income growth, in terms of income tax revenue growth. So we have been a star state in an economy nationally that's doing extremely well. Now the question, of course, is will that continue into 98 and beyond? I think a couple of things to point out. First of all is that as we see the data flow in for the end of 97, we are seeing some slowing in the Oregon State economy. Our third quarter growth was the lowest in 5.5 years in terms of job growth. We bounced back a bit in the fourth quarter. We just got the numbers yesterday as the strikes at UPS and Kaiser were settled. But our job growth annual rate was about 3.2% in the fourth quarter. That's still pretty good, but it's not the 4% we were recording in 94 through 96. We do see some softness appearing in the construction sector. Construction's always a tough one in the winter in particular because the weather patterns are always different. But we did see a 4.5% decline in construction jobs in the fourth quarter. We're seeing a definite slowdown in in-migration. The preliminary Portland State estimates for population growth for 97 put us at the lowest growth rate in population in a decade. So we're starting to see a bit of that evidence out there. On the other hand, our high-tech sector continues to do very well. We get daily income tax data from the Department of Revenue, and boy, you know, on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of December, there were huge jumps in estimated tax payments. In other words, people there that had gotten bonus payments in particular or gotten stock options are looking at their tax payments and realize, gee, I've been under withheld and I'm going to get penalized unless I get some money in before the end of the year. So there's been a lot of income made in this state either through the stock market or through the strength in the high-tech sector and wage growth throughout the economy. So the revenue stream is still pretty healthy. I will point out that in terms of Dan's question about the fiscal policy for the federal government, the reason why the deficit has gone away is because income tax have taken a big jump. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that federal revenue would grow about 4% last fiscal year, back last January. It grew 10%. They're talking in Washington, D.C. about where did all this money come from at the end of the year. It doesn't really show up in the hard data. It's probably stock market related. We've had 3 remarkable years of growth in the stock market. The Dow Jones average has gone up over 20% each of the last 3 years. That's never happened. So capital gains and the stock options associated with that are driving income taxes at a very rapid rate. And they're growing about 10% in Oregon. Now, we've had 10% growth in income taxes before, but we also had 8 or 10% inflation. Now we've got 10% revenue growth and 2% inflation. So truly remarkable period in terms of growth. We are seeing some slowing in our corporate income taxes. And our biggest taxpayer in the state, Intel, is starting to see some slowdown in its corporate profits. So they're still very profitable, but if you look at their year-over-year earnings, they're about flat from where they were last year. They're not generating 40 to 50% annual gains like they were last year. So taking all that into account, we think that this trend we've seen over the last year of a gradual deceleration is going to continue. We think, as John does, that the national economy is going to stay out of recession. As long as that's the case, Oregon is looking for a slowdown in terms of its overall growth rate. We estimate jobs increased about 3.5% last year. We're predicting 2.6% for 1998. So still fairly healthy growth. That would be enough to keep our unemployment rate to around 5.1, 5.2. We wouldn't see much upward pressure on unemployment if we can generate that kind of job growth. Income, we think, grew about 6.7% last year. We think about 5.6% in 98. If you take out inflation, that's a drop from 4.6% down to 3.7. Those are all healthy numbers compared to the historical norms. They're just not as good as we saw over the 94-96 period. We do think, as a result of Asia, that there are some puts and takes, pluses and minuses for the national economy. Lower interest rates, of course, will help, but weaker exports, as John pointed out, are clearly going to hurt. Well, where does Oregon stand in all of that? Well, Oregon is going to be a loser in that, a net loser. There's no doubt about it. If you look at exports as a percent of the economy, or exports to Asia, Oregon ranks number 3 among the states. Only Alaska and Washington have a higher percentage of their economy directly tied to Asian exports. And that's no surprise. I mean, you've heard it, I'm sure, for the last decade that a big advantage Oregon has is the Pacific Rim. Our location on the Pacific Rim has really helped us. In the long term, it will be a big plus for Oregon. But the next year or two is not going to be a plus. So it's going to slow us down. Now, what we think is going to happen is the wide gap we've seen between Oregon's growth rate and the U.S. growth rate is going to narrow as a result of that. We see the U.S. economy staying out of recession, and we see Oregon's growth rate moderating down near the national average. So Oregon's risks are there. You look at our export markets, 5 of our top 6 export markets are in Asia. So we clearly do have some exposure. In summary, and I hear the bell, Dan, in summary, we think that we're headed for some slower growth in Oregon, and we're headed for a growth rate closer than the national average than what we've seen in the previous part of the 90s. But generally, our outlook is that the economy will continue to grow at a more moderate pace and a generally favorable outlook. As long as the U.S. economy stays out of recession, we think Oregon's going to still do fairly well.
Okay, Loren, you're on.
Thank you, Dan. I've been a little worried about the downsizing in the local market here and what would happen to people like economists who are thought to be secondary employees and not very productive, but John does have another career in poetry if necessary. If you want to get a laugh at any gathering of market experts, all you need to say is it's different this time, because there is a general assumption that no matter how the world changes, that there are some immutable rules of investment which bring prices back to a certain rational sense, which is predictable ahead of time. And I'm here to tell you that I don't believe that. It's been different every decade since the 1930s, and it's very different this time. If it weren't different, I'd be bringing you a much more pessimistic story than I have to tell you today. But 1998 is still going to be a challenge. As you know, the markets have been going up strongly the last 3 years, about 30% average returns on the averages. All of the normal fundamentals are heavily extended, with price earnings multiples being very high, return on equity and investment being the highest in about 15 years. Mutual fund cash is at its low. All of these things are reasons why one would be very apprehensive about how well the markets could do in 1998. And indeed, there is a cyclical momentum in this economy which makes us believe that those people who are estimating earnings gains, and this is a common estimate of about 15% growth in S&P stocks this year, that those people will be wrong, and that instead we may see growth of somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5%. How will that impact people as those numbers are reported? Well, I think a large part of the uncertainty has now been assigned to Asian questions, and there will be many people who will blame the Asian markets and competitors for the impact that they have on American earnings. But there are plenty of other reasons, just cyclical ones, for those earnings to be flattening out this year in any case. Only 15% of our gross domestic product is oriented toward imports and exports, but as Paul points out, there are many industries that are affected much more than that. And there are many of those industries need only one competitor, international competitor, willing to cut price to see most of the profitability disappear. And in places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Thailand, who believe their only way out of their mess is to export heavily during this next year, you can expect that in most industries there will be heavy price cutting. There are predictions, for instance, that Hyundais will be exported into this market for a cost of about $8,000, down from $11,000 average during 1997. So what can we expect in 1998 in the marketplace? I think that the bad news will come along the way as earnings in this first quarter are reported in April. Between now and April, most of the news that will affect the markets will not be particularly bad. You will see three phases of this Asian problem. The first, the collapse of the markets, is behind us. With the Indonesian market down 85%, it can't go down a whale of a lot more. The second phase will be the engaging of the Asian economies into the Western markets and the impact on Western companies. The third phase will be how the American markets react to that news. All that will be played out over the first 3 quarters of this year. During that period of time, I think that there will be times when American investors will withdraw from the market, which they can do to a certain degree, into areas like REITs and bonds. The downside, the technical side of this market is about 20%, is down to around the 6,000 level. I would anticipate that sometime during this year that we will see the market approaching that 6,000 level from its current 7,800. However, the main impact on the marketplace during the last decade will still be the main impact in 1998 and for the next 10 years, and that is the huge flow of retirement funds that Americans have now decided must be in the marketplace in order for them to have adequate funds for retirement. There's about $20 billion a month that has been flowing into American mutual funds, and that money can only be parked somewhere else for a relatively short period of time. So irrespective of all of the high fundamentals in the stock market today, the main controlling factor for the next several years, including 1998, is going to be a simple supply and demand equation in which $20 billion a month has to find some place to go. So I would anticipate that if by mid-year we see a period of time, or perhaps in the third quarter, that the stock market is very weak, there will then be stories that arise of how this is a great buying opportunity, and we will see that money flowing back into the marketplace. So that before the end of the year, you might very well see it very close to the price that it was at the beginning of the year. I would say that there are 2 or 3 things that could intervene along the way that would make this a forecast inaccurate. One would be what happens to interest rates. And one of the first things we should understand is when Asia got into trouble, the first impact was a good impact on American markets because 2 factors were operating. There were many companies and investors overseas that decided that they must pull their money and their investments out of Asian markets and put it somewhere safe. That money in general came into the American markets, and that's what put interest rates down as far as they were during the months of November and December. As Asia begins to straighten itself out later in 1998, I think we can anticipate that that money will begin to flow back into Asian markets looking for bargains, and this may cause interest rates to rise somewhat. I think we can also anticipate that the fundamentals that have engaged, that will be engaging this market with pessimism during the first several months of the year will begin to work their way through as well, and we will look back or forward into 1999 as a year in which we will see a recovery in the economy and therefore another chance for people to pour that $20 billion a month into equities at somewhat lower prices than what they're paying now. So I think that 1998 will be looked upon as one of those years that we had in 1987 and again in 1994, when a specific shock came along, an external shock, to make people revise their confidence toward the market, but then in retrospect is seen as a grand opportunity to reinvest. I do believe that by the time that the cash flow coming into 401ks diminishes after the year 2008, we will see these prices once again. But between now and 2008, we should see even higher prices. Thank you.
Now we're going to ask the panelists to ask each other one question. John, let's start with you.
Thanks, Dan. Loren, I want to ask you about that Y2K problem. I mean, I'm sort of getting more and more intrigued with this. Fortune had an article with anecdotes about things that were starting to happen. Grocery stores shutting down when somebody threw in a card or a debit card that had a 2,000 on it. I mean, how serious do you think that problem is?
I'm not very concerned about it, John. It does seem to me that the cost of conversion will subtract from more productive investments between now and then, things that normally would go toward being contributable to the bottom line. But certainly there are people who have already fixed the problems. Those who decide that they can postpone that will probably be relatively uncompetitive for a short period of time. I do not believe that it's going to be looked upon as a major difficulty, although Ed Yardeni, one of the chief economists on the street, has used that as a story that distinguishes him from his colleagues. I think it's more that than it is an actual factor of cost.
Paul, could I ask you to comment? If billions are going to be spent by companies to straighten out that computer glitch, will this favorably impact the Oregon economy and its high-tech electronics?
First of all, I'll just say that our economic models show the world ending in the year 2000. So I do think that the major effect I think we've seen from the Y2K has been an increase in those who have some expertise, particularly programming expertise, and a lot of old programming languages that had kind of dropped off in terms of demand. Now suddenly these folks are in very strong demand, and we're seeing a lot of income and some shifted their way. So that's a positive. I think what's driving the Oregon economy is the general shift toward information technology. To the extent that this speeds it up and changes the timing, there could be some positive feedbacks for Oregon in the short term. You know, I do think that there is some basis in kind of the Yardeni argument that there is some risk in the year 2000. One thing, we've had a recession in every year that ends with a zero. So I don't know if that is figured into this or not, but and of course, it also depends on who wins the Super Bowl.
I didn't mean to. Yeah, you get a chance to ask a question now.
Okay. My question also is of Loren. I talk to John all the time, so I'll ask Loren a question. You know, I think very interesting argument, and one that I definitely agree with, is that a lot of pension money is coming into the financial markets. Demographics play an important role. But one of the issues that I've thought about is, doesn't Asia represent a very significant buying opportunity now? And is some of that money, you're talking about where it can be parked, will a portion of that be parked in Asia? And when do you see that as starting to build those markets back up again, or if it will?
Yeah, that's a good question, Paul. I think that most American investment in Asian markets has gone through a relatively narrow group of professional investors. Most of those professional investors, I think, were relying on Asian banks for information about where that money could be applied. As you probably know, the Asian economies differ very much from the Latin economies in that most of the investments are directly connected to the banks. And in many of the Asian nations with the IMF regulations and restrictions, those banks have been damaged very sharply, very heavily. In Indonesia, the first 16 banks were shut down, and that would have been something that worked in Mexico. Unfortunately, that caused most Indonesians to believe that if those were the first targeted 16, that the next 80 would go soon. And the entire banking structure was paralyzed. So it's really, I believe, too early for anybody but rank speculators to begin to put money back into Asia. I think that will pertain throughout most of 1998. There was a story in the New York Times that some of you may have seen talking about a Korean company that was a medium-sized company that had excellent products, good employees, and had always been able to deliver competitively to its customers. It was in danger of going bankrupt because while it had very good finances itself, the companies that it relied on to deliver to it and the people that it relied on to distribute its products were all small companies that were undercapitalized, underfinanced, and had had their money cut off from their banking system. So this was a company that was perfectly good, perfectly capable of operating, but it was going to go bankrupt sometime within the next 2 weeks. When that chain breaks down, it seems to me that it's foolhardy to assume that it's going to be built back up when all of the foreign investors have left and somehow the country has to recover on its own.
Okay, Loren, now you get a chance to ask a question.
I'd like to ask Paul if he sees the Oregon high-tech industries being decimated by the declines in prices, or maybe we should say the increase in prices for American and Oregon high-tech companies when the American dollar has gone up as much as 60% against the Asian competitors. And what does that do to the future growth rate and employment in Oregon?
Well, Oregon has long been sensitive to changing exchange rates. In the past, of course, it's tended to work through our resource sectors, through agriculture and lumber and wood products. The rise in the dollar in the early 80s was part of the story that caused the Oregon economy to decline so much. Now with the so-called new Oregon economy, where high-tech is such a big player, I still think that we have definite sensitivity to exchange rates. We are highly dependent on export activity, so there is going to be some negative effect. The high-tech companies, though, are a little different in terms of their global role. One thing, there is quite a bit of production that goes on from the high-tech companies. Most obviously Intel, who has plants throughout Asia. They do have some positive side effects in seeing some of their production costs lower as a result of lower local currency. So they do have some positive feedback. The other aspect about the high-tech companies is their global reach is more than our commodity producers, which have tended to focus on Asia because of transportation costs, whereas high-tech products that are easier to ship, less costly to ship, and can be shipped by air, we see a lot more, a broader market, including Europe. And we do see some fair increases now with Europe coming back. If the European economy can recover and come back, then that'll provide some cushion for the high-tech companies. But I think the answer is negative, but not as negative as what we've seen historically in Oregon's resource-based economy.
Thank you. Carolyn Board with the board host question of the week. And then would you please line up those of you who have questions while Carolyn is asking hers so that you can ask your questions without any interruption.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank the panel very much for this very interesting presentation that just brings up lots of questions, but has answered some as well. My question has to do with people moving into this state, and it has, in some ways, it's been a generator of our economy. If that slows down, it certainly solve some of the problems that we have in terms of trying to figure out how to house more people and how to move them around and those sorts of things. But what if that in-migration actually slows down substantially, what kind of economic impacts do you see that we might have?
Okay, I'll start it anyway. Well, you've already seen it start to happen. You know, Paul talked about the Portland State numbers. The Census Bureau's numbers show, again, a slowing in the Oregon population growth rate. I was looking at, for unrelated reasons, I was looking at driver's license numbers this morning. In the last quarter of 1997, the number of licenses surrendered in Oregon by people moving from out of state was down about 6%. The number from California was down 12%. Where you're going to see that, you're going to see it in the real estate sector, and I would argue you've already started to see that. Look at the multiple listing data. You can see a big increase in listings and essentially flat sales. You've seen some weakening start to take place there. There's been a significant transfer of income and wealth into the state. If you look at the tax return, not that I look at the tax returns, but the IRS data, you look at the average stuff, the tax returns and so forth, the people moving here is much higher incomes than people moving out. I mean, there's a transfer of income, wealth, education to the state. And that's going to be part of the process of the slowing down. You don't have to come to Oregon to get a job now.
I think the sector that we look at as most risky right now from the local sector, other than the national factors, is construction for this very reason. And that's where, if we do see a more dramatic slowing in migration, then that's where that'll be felt right away. And John's right, we're beginning to see that construction sector slide a little bit, but it's also from an extremely high level of activity. We've had really a construction boom in this state over the last 3 years.
David Wu, City Club member. I have a two-part question, one international and one domestic. The international part for Loren Wyss, we've seen the Malaysian and Indonesian economies go into the tank, and the Taiwan and the Indian economies hold up a little bit better. And commentators as diverse as Martin Lee of Hong Kong or William Safire of our own Far East have said that there's a correlation between the degree of democracy and the rule of law and human rights in an economy and its long-term stability. I'd like you to comment on whether you might see a correlation internationally or not? And the domestic part of the question for John Mitchell, for a more prosperous 98, should we pull for the Broncos or Green Bay?
David, I guess the first one is for me. I believe that there is a direct link between the openness of the economic part of a society and the political side of a society. And in places that have had either dictatorships or oligopolies that have pretty much controlled the economy, there's a much greater chance for disaster. And I think Indonesia is the primary example of that. Thailand is another place that apparently even the new president was shocked to find out how badly the economy was riddled with holes. So I'd agree with you that that kind of a correlation probably does exist. That has not been the major view of investors, however, and I think investment capital in the past generally discounts anything political with the exception of the potential for revolution. The expectation in many of those countries is that there were either goods or services or labor that would be cheaper than they might be in other places. And I would expect that that kind of thinking would continue to rule in spite of the punishment that it's taken over the last few months. And most of that punishment, I would point out, unfortunately redounds to the domestic citizenry because that foreign capital to a large degree has moved away.
If we want to see something old to keep going, I think we should probably vote for Denver.
Mike Katz, I'm a member of the club. Today's bulletin contained 4 questions. They were teasers. And briefly, they say, do the rules of economic history still apply, or are we entering a new epoch? And the second question, has America finally reached full capacity for growth, or will changes in technology and globalization permanently increase productivity? Third question, will Wall Street continue to post record highs? And the fourth question, and how might volatile markets in Asia shake up the Northwest region and the country's trade deficit? Well, you know, there has been, by way of asking my question, there has been a fair amount of scholarly research on the subject whether anyone in general and economists in particular are able to forecast the future. And I think the honest answer, the technically correct answer to all these questions from your perspective and everybody else's is, I don't know. Do you subscribe to that theory or not? I've detected a certain lack of modesty here.
Who did you aim that at?
Yeah. All 3 of the panel.
Go ahead, John. Oh, thanks. You know, Mike, Mike's a member of the fraternity, but you know, we try, and you're gonna, as Paul said, you do the forecast. You know you're going to be wrong, but you hopefully sort of to minimize that error. I mean, if you look at direction. All right. I mean, we've had nobody was really forecasting a recession last year. Basically, people were expecting to see a continuation of the expansion, not dramatic changes in inflation, but people didn't catch maybe one, Ed Yardini and some others looking about a significant decline in inflation. You're not going to get the real details, but I think that that we can make a contribution from a trend standpoint. And sort of picking up some of the major factors. I don't think the rules of business cycle have been repealed. You look around now, the imbalances that you customarily saw at the latter stages of other cycles are simply not there. Major inventory problems, a surge in inflation, major excesses in real estate, they're not there, which implies that this thing should go on a bit longer. I'm not necessarily ready to buy the new paradigm yet.
Well, I'd just say if you didn't have revenue forecasts, and you wouldn't have a 2% surplus kicker check coming to you. So it's essential for individuals. No, it's clearly something that I think anybody who's been involved in it recognizes that there's no way to be perfectly accurate. But I think what you can do is lay out the forces that are out there, try to give some structure and some framework for discussing what the possibilities are. And then I see my job as trying to shoot for something in the middle, as a range of plausible outcomes, given what we know and what past relationships have been. Where would we be if we were right about in the middle of that plausible range? And I think that serves a real useful role in public sector planning and in private sector planning as well. You know, the other element of it, too, is to identify that range and what the risks are. And that, I think, is important, too.
I'm going to take a prerogative of the moderator and make one comment on Mike Katz's question. I've argued many times with Mike because Mike doesn't think that anything has an effect on the economy except the market, that nothing can influence it. And I just want to say that I've been watching over the years, the blue chip forecast is a consensus of economists, 53 of them, and they have a high, a low, and a consensus, and I have never found them wrong as to direction, only as to degree. So there must be something to the forecasting business. Ray?
Ray Polonius.
I was just going to say to Mike that it does seem to me that we have entered an era in which we know the term globalization, but we have not yet worked out all the impacts of it. And so it probably does mean that if we use data from the past, we are going to be perhaps not only more often deceived, but the amount of the deception might be more serious than in the past. So I think it's a harder business than it was before.
Ray Polonius, City Club member. My question has to do with the fact that both the national and Oregon economy are doing very, very well, and the tendency is to go into tax cuts and return money to people. Wouldn't it be perhaps a good time, since the times are good, to invest in infrastructure? And I'm thinking of human infrastructure as well as durable infrastructure. And I realize that money in the pocket of people might mean that in a roundabout way, of course, but there are certain functions that perhaps governmental infusion of money in infrastructure building for the future would be better. What's the opinion?
I guess I'll take the first stab at that. You know, it is important to recognize that we have had significant tax cuts in Oregon in the 90s, both in terms of permanent cuts through Measure 5 and Measure 50 on property taxes. Property tax collections last year were less than they were in 1991. So there has been an outright reduction at the same time the economy's grown very rapidly. The other point is we've had a series of temporary tax cuts, which result from comparing the forecast, income tax forecast, with the projection in the 2% kicker surplus. You've had temporary tax cuts and permanent ones through property taxes. In terms of the infrastructure effects of that, that's I think the most debated issue right now in Salem with the governor and the legislative leadership. But what's the right level of infrastructure? It's a tough one because we know that as economists, those effects are long term. And they're not something that we can see overnight or next year, but there are definitely negative consequences to underinvesting in terms of education and in terms of transportation systems. So there's no real agreement on what is the proper level, although I think you're absolutely right. There is agreement that if you underinvest, then you're going to see negative consequences. The problem is you don't really start to see those negative consequences clearly until it's too late to turn it around. It takes a while to turn it back around. So it's a tough issue, and I think it'll be really the dominant issue in the 99 legislative session.
And one point on that is if you look around the region and the debate that's going on in Oregon is going on in Washington, is going on in Idaho. I mean, the states that have experienced the rapid growth are facing a lot of pressure on their infrastructure. But what they run up against is sort of the Milton Friedman, Danny DeVito line, there is no end to the good that can be done with other people's money. You know, and so you've got that conflict.
I was hanging in suspense to see how Ray was going to get transportation worked into this, but he only said infrastructure. question on the in-migration. I think, Paul, it was you who said you don't have to come to Oregon anymore to get a job, and there are clear indications that the in-migration has slowed down. How much of this do you ascribe to the fact that it's so out of balance with the cost of real estate compared to the incomes that are earned in the state? And maybe a little ancillary, maybe I should have asked Mike Burton this, how do we think that works in with the urban growth boundary?
Well, the housing price increase issue is one we have tracked very closely and have been concerned about it because of what it might do to migration, what it might do to the construction growth and so forth. We've had very rapid home price appreciation, some of the highest in the country. But we've also had very strong income growth. So there's been those two occurring. And the period that we began to get the rapid price appreciation, we were, I think, beyond consensus and universal agreement that we were way low compared to the West Coast. So we had a catch-up period to go through. And the question is, have we caught up and have we gotten too high on the other side? I think we're no longer a cheap place to live. And I think that's a factor slowing in migration. And I think we're going to see some pretty soft housing markets as a result of that. I think there's going to be a period of coming back in line. So the answer, I think, is that those rapid price increases are going to slow down.
We can have one more question that needs to be very brief.
Bud Forrester, City Club member. Oregon produces some 200 agricultural commodities. I've heard the theory that our greatest single opportunity for the economy is through the growth, processing, and exporting of agricultural products. What do you see as the future, any one of you, or all of you?
I think the immediate impact, Bud, is that we're going to have resistance to most of our domestic products of any kind this year because of the huge increase in costs in the Asian markets. This will sort itself out over the period of the next 18 months, but I'm sure there will be some very negative surprises to the producers of commodities here.
I would add a longer-term concern. I think that is a huge advantage for Oregon is its diversity of its ag sector, and there is some definite prospects for long-term growth. But I'm concerned about land use competition in the Willamette Valley because we have two of our top three ag counties are Marion and Clackamas County, and that's where the population growth is occurring. So I'm concerned about competition for land and driving up domestic costs as well as the value of the dollar.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you to all of you. It was a wonderful program. You are charming economists, each and every one of you. And I suspect that I will be racing all of you to the Hyundai dealership. I expect to get a head start. To me, this all sounds a little bit like forecasting a good wine. It sounds like 98 might be a good 94 Pinot Noir with maybe just a little bit of tannin. And we certainly do appreciate hearing about it and thank this fabulous panel very much indeed. Thank you. We're adjourned.
Thank you, Dan.
That was fabulous. That was fun. Yeah, you guys were good. Thank you very much. It was terrific.
Thank you, Ernie. Good.
That was wonderful.